Innocent black veteran detained by police. Army captain leads stunning response. Most mornings, Elias Carter rode his motorcycle down the quiet roads of his small town. Nobody paid him much attention, just an old black man in a faded Vietnam vet cap riding a shiny old bike. But that bike wasn't just any bike. It was a 1965 BSA Lightning he had rebuilt piece by piece over 10 long years. The engine purred like it was brand new, and the black paint caught the sunlight just right. To Elias, it wasn't just a machine, it was therapy. A way to keep his hands and mind busy when the memories got loud. Elias was 72. His back wasn't what it used to be. His knees had been replaced, and he walked with a quiet stiffness. But when he was on that bike, he felt free again. Like the 20-year-old soldier who once moved through thick jungle, leading men through danger with steady hands and calm words. He had a routine. Ride out early. Wave at the lady in her garden. Nod to the old man with his coffee and morning paper. Peaceful. Predictable. Until one morning, it wasn't. That day, he had barely made it a mile outside town when he heard sirens behind him. Flashing red and blue in his mirror. A cop car flying up fast. Elias calmly pulled over to the shoulder. No sudden movements. He parked his bike gently and removed his gloves. Placed them neatly in his jacket. He stayed seated, hands resting on his thighs where they could be seen. After all, he'd lived in this country long enough to know what could happen if he didn't. The police cruiser screeched to a stop behind him. The door flew open with force, and a tall officer stepped out. Young, white, broad-shouldered. His name badge read Denton. His hand was already on his weapon, and his sunglasses reflected Elias's own image back at him. An old black man on a motorcycle, calm and still. "Stay where you are," Denton barked. "Good morning, officer," Elias said, his voice steady and polite. Denton didn't answer. He walked around the bike, eyes filled with suspicion. "You steal this bike, old man?" he snapped. "Ain't got no plates." Elias stayed calm. "No, sir. I've owned this bike for over 40 years. It's a 1965 BSA Lightning. Street legal. I have the paperwork right here." He moved his hand slowly toward his jacket pocket, where his license and registration sat tucked away. "Hands where I can see 'em," Denton shouted, stepping closer. His fingers tensed on his holster. Elias froze. "Yes, sir, not reaching." Another officer stepped out from the passenger side. A younger woman, maybe Latina, with a more careful look in her eyes. She didn't say anything, just watched. Denton stepped in again. "Looks like a stolen piece of junk to me. We've had reports." Elias nodded slowly. "Again, sir, everything's in order." Denton ignored him. He started poking at the bike with his nightstick, tapping the pipes, scratching the polished chrome. "Please be careful," Elias said quietly. "You deaf?" Denton snapped. "I'll handle this how I see fit." Elias felt the familiar heaviness in his chest. This wasn't the first time. Not the first time he'd been treated like a criminal for being who he was. But this time felt worse. He reached for his phone in his pocket. "I'd like to record this interaction," he said calmly. Before, he could press record. Denton smacked the phone out of his hand. It hit the ground and cracked. "That's destruction of personal property," Elias said, still keeping his voice even. People nearby had started watching. A young woman across the street held her phone up, recording. An older couple slowed there. Walk. A man in a pickup parked and started filming too. "Turn those off," Denton shouted at the bystanders. Nobody listened. "Get off the bike," he ordered Elias. With effort, Elias stood, using the bike for balance. "On your knees." "I'm 72 years old, officer," Elias replied. "Two artificial knees." "On your knees," Denton shouted again, louder now. So Elias did, slowly, painfully. Gravel dug into his joints. Old war injuries screamed in protest. His pride stayed where it was, high, but his body had to yield. As Denton began to pat him down roughly, Elias looked up and said something quiet. Too quiet for the cop to understand at first. "You don't know who I am." Blood trickled down Elias's lip. And just over the hill, the rumble began. Denton had no idea what was coming, but Elias knew, and he didn't even blink. The rumble grew louder. At first, Denton thought it was just a big truck coming down the road, but it wasn't just one sound. It was several deep, engine growls coming together like a slow-moving thunderstorm. The officer turned slightly, confused. His hand still gripped his nightstick, still holding power over the kneeling old man on the roadside. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He just waited, like a man who'd seen 100 storms and knew this one would pass too. The woman across the street kept filming. Her hands were shaking now. The older couple had stopped walking entirely. The man in the pickup rolled his window down, his camera phone still up. That's when the first Humvee came into view. Military green, polished, and moving with quiet purpose. Then another, and another. 6 total, forming a line down the road. A large armored SUV followed, dark-tinted windows and government plates. Behind that, several black vehicles rolled in, one after the other, until the small rural road looked more like a presidential motorcade than anything this town had ever seen. Officer Morales, the quiet one standing behind Denton, took a step back. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest radio. "Denton," she said quietly, "I think you should look behind you." "What the hell is this?" Denton muttered, turning around fully now. His face changed. The confidence drained from his expression like water down a sink. Out of the lead, Humvee stepped a tall black man in full military dress. Ribbons, pins, polished boots, gloves white as snow. He walked with precision, the kind of calm confidence only learned in war zones and command posts. His posture straight, his eyes focused. He walked right past Denton, didn't even look at him. He walked straight up to Elias, still on the ground, blood on his lip, dignity unbroken. The officer stopped in front of him. Then he did something no one expected. He saluted. A full, perfect salute. "Major Carter, sir." His voice was clear and firm, carrying over the stunned silence. Gasps from the crowd, camera shutters clicking now. Elias looked up slowly, his tired eyes meeting the younger man's. "At ease, Captain," he said, his voice low, but still sharp. 2 soldiers stepped forward from another vehicle, helping Elias to his feet with care, like lifting something sacred. The military men and women now stood in a wide circle, their bodies forming a quiet barrier between Elias and the officer who had forced him to kneel. Denton stepped back, hands open, trying to figure out what was happening. Wait, what is this? He's a suspect. He refused to... Captain Andrew Hale turned. His tone was still calm, but cold. "You just assaulted one of the most decorated living veterans in this country," he said, his eyes locked on Denton. "You're going to want to step aside." "This is police business," Denton barked, grasping for authority. "Not anymore." Another voice cut in from behind. From one of the black SUVs stepped a woman in a dark suit, holding up a badge. "FBI, Special Agent Lisa Warren. We've been monitoring this town's law enforcement for weeks." Denton's face went pale. She continued, "This stop just made our job a lot easier." Officer Morales stepped forward, voice steady now. "I'd like to make a statement about Officer Denton's conduct before the military arrived." Denton spun on her. "You're finished," he snapped. "You're a rookie. That sounds like witness intimidation," Captain Hale observed, his voice sharp. Warren nodded. "Officer Morales will take your full statement at the station. Officer Denton," she stepped forward, "please hand over your badge and service weapon." "What?" Denton looked around, his voice cracking. "You can't be serious. He planned this. He set me up." Elias didn't say a word. He walked slowly toward his bike, inspecting it for damage. His lip was still bleeding, but his posture was straight, strong. He wiped at a fresh scratch on the side of the tank with his sleeve, almost gently. Then he turned to Denton. "Next time," Elias said quietly, not raising his voice, not even stepping closer. "You might want to know who you're talking to." Denton just stared, his mouth slightly open, his eyes bouncing between soldiers, FBI agents, and cameras now live streaming everything to the internet. Elias turned to Captain Hale. "I'd like to ride home." Hale nodded. "We'll escort you, sir." And just like that, Elias mounted his motorcycle again. The old engine came to life, smooth and familiar. The Humvees took formation around him. The FBI cars followed behind. As they pulled away from the scene, the crowd of bystanders began to applaud. Soft at first, then louder. Elias didn't wave, he didn't smile, he just rode. Because for him, this wasn't a moment of victory, it was just another battle, and he had more left to fight. The ride home wasn't silent, but it felt that way. Elias Carter rode at the center of a convoy of military Humvees and black SUVs. Engines hummed, tires rolled smoothly over country asphalt. But inside Elias's mind, it was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. Like the stillness before a storm. The kind you remember from war zones. The road was familiar, but nothing about the morning felt normal anymore. The old mailbox on the corner, the white fence with peeling paint, the sleepy porch where someone rocked slowly in a chair. They were all there. And yet, everything had changed. As the convoy turned into his gravel driveway, a small crowd had already gathered near his home. Neighbors, passers-by, local reporters. Phones were raised, eyes wide, mouths whispering. They had seen the videos. It had gone viral faster than anyone expected. The image of a 72-year-old black veteran being forced to kneel by a white police officer, then saluted by a military captain, had captured the nation's attention. Not just because it was shocking, but because it was real, raw, and far too familiar for many. Captain Hale stepped out of the lead vehicle as Elias cut the engine on. His bike. "We've got security detail in place for the evening," he said softly. "Local law enforcement has been sidelined." Elias gave him a small nod. He didn't want a security detail. Never had. But he understood the necessity. He stepped off his bike slowly. His knees were still sore from being forced to the ground earlier, but he didn't show it. Pain was something he had long since learned to carry like an old jacket. Uncomfortable, but familiar. Inside his modest home, Elias sat at the small kitchen table where he'd eaten thousands of quiet meals alone. His hand rested on the tabletop for a moment, steadying himself. Then, he opened the drawer and pulled out a weathered folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, photos, and official letters that no one had looked at in decades. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. The photo on top showed a young version of Elias, in uniform, standing beside a helicopter. A handwritten note was taped to the corner. Tannin Province, 68, 43 men out, all came home. Jackson, that moment, the rescue that had earned Elias the Bronze Star, had been buried for years, along with everything else. Medals stripped, reputation destroyed. Why? Because he'd testified. Because he'd told the truth. He'd stood in front of a military court and named names. He'd said what others wouldn't, that certain commanders had knowingly targeted civilians, that orders were given to erase evidence, that the war wasn't just ugly, it was being covered up. And for that, he was punished, disgraced, erased, until today. Today, the world saw him. But Elias didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. A quiet knock on the screen door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Officer Morales, the younger cop from the morning. She stood alone, no badge visible, no weapon on her belt. "Sir," she said quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened, for what he did." Elias studied her face. She looked nervous, but not fake. He nodded once. "You spoke up. That matters." "I should have done more," she said, voice cracking just slightly. "You did enough. The rest wasn't yours to fix." She handed him a small envelope. "FBI asked me for a full statement. I gave it. Everything. Even what I've seen from other officers." "Good," Elias said, taking it. She hesitated, then added, "There are more like me, you know. Not all of us wear the badge like a shield. Some of us actually want to protect people." Elias nodded. "Then keep doing that. It'll matter more than you know." She gave a slight, respectful nod, then turned and walked back to her car. Elias watched her leave, then turned toward his garage. Inside, his tools were neatly lined up on a wooden pegboard. Next to them hung a faded military backpack, untouched for years. He unzipped it slowly. Maps, contacts, letters from old brothers in arms. A list he'd been keeping in his head for decades. Names of men and women who had been chewed up and spit out by the very system they swore to defend. He thought he'd spend the rest of his life alone, quietly fixing bikes and avoiding headlines. But this morning had changed everything. The world was watching now. The forgotten line, that quiet network of veterans helping other veterans behind the scenes, was about to get loud. He picked up the phone. No hesitation. "Captain Hale," he said when the line connected. "You still got that roster from Baghdad?" "Yes, sir," Hale replied. "Why?" "Because it's time. We're not just fixing this for me. We're fixing it for everyone they forgot." There was silence. Then Hale replied simply, "Say the word." Elias looked out the window at the reporters now setting up tripods on the edge of his property. He took a deep breath. Start the ride. By the time the sun set that evening, Elias's front yard was lit up with camera flashes and quiet tension. He didn't care for attention, never had. But this time, he wasn't just a man on a motorcycle. He had become a symbol. Not because he wanted to, but because the world finally saw something it had spent too long ignoring. Across the country, the video of him kneeling on the side of the road, blood on his lip, had already been viewed millions of times. Not because it was shocking, but because it felt familiar. It wasn't new, just finally undeniable. The old soldier mistreated, the proud veteran ignored, the black man assumed guilty. Only this time, the cavalry showed up. That night, Elias sat in his kitchen with Captain Hale and Agent Warren from the FBI. His coffee had gone cold, untouched. The folder of documents still sat open on the table between them. Photos, names, testimony, all buried in time. "We believe you," Warren said. "More than that, we've been investigating some of the same departments. What happened this morning wasn't isolated." Elias didn't look up from the photo in his hand, a younger version of himself, standing next to soldiers he hadn't seen in decades. Most were gone now. A few might still be out there. "Then it's time to bring the rest of them in," he said quietly. Captain Hale nodded. "I've already made some calls. The old network's still there, quiet, scattered. But they've been waiting for something like this. Someone like this." Elias shook his head. "Not someone like this. Someone like us. I'm not doing this for headlines. This isn't about me." Warren leaned forward. "Then what is it about?" Elias looked her dead in the eye. "It's about making sure nobody else has to kneel." The next morning, they started calling it the Forgotten Line. It began as a hashtag, something small. But it caught fire fast. Veterans from all backgrounds began sharing their stories online. Photos of tattered uniforms, denied claims, evictions, medication delays. Soldiers who'd returned from war only to fight a new battle at home, one against silence, poverty, and disrespect. But it wasn't just stories, it was action. Old friends of Elias, men and women from Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, started showing up. First, just a few, then a dozen, then busloads. Some came in wheelchairs, others walked with canes. One man arrived riding a 3-wheeled Harley with oxygen tubes in his nose and a photo of his fallen unit taped to the windshield. They didn't come for speeches. They came to stand beside a man who had once carried them through the jungle, through injustice, through silence. And Elias? He greeted each one the same way, with a handshake, a nod, and the same quiet words. Still standing. Good. Let's move. Local news stations were first on the scene, then the national ones. By the end of the week, Elias's small garage had been transformed into a planning hub. Folding tables were stacked with maps, printed photos, news clippings, and handwritten notes. The military might have forgotten these veterans, but they hadn't forgotten how to organize. Captain Hale set up a chain of command. Young volunteers ran comms. Old-timers made calls across the country. They didn't need internet influencers or paid PR. They had each other. The mission was simple: visibility. No violence, no standoffs, no politics. Just a peaceful ride across state lines to show the world who was still here. They called it the Ride for Respect. It would start in Elias's hometown and end at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. No shouting, no marching, just hundreds of veterans riding together, shoulder to shoulder, so that no one could ignore them anymore. But not everyone welcomed the attention. As the movement grew, so did the pushback. Local officials started questioning Elias's military record. One anchor on national television asked if this was all staged. "How do we know this isn't just a political stunt?" he sneered. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't post videos. He didn't go live. He didn't tweet. Instead, he walked out to the driveway, stood beside his vintage motorcycle, and spoke to the one local reporter who showed up respectfully. "I'm not here to be a hero," he said. "I'm here because too many real heroes got left behind, and we're going to ride. Not for attention, but so the next generation never gets forgotten like we did." That 30-second clip went viral again, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. The night before the ride began, Elias stood, alone in his garage, running a cloth over his bike's chrome finish. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of engines being tuned in the driveway. He paused, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a single challenge. Coin, faded and worn. He stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into his pocket. The kind of weight you carry when you're not riding alone anymore. And for the first time in years, Elias Carter smiled. Because tomorrow, they would ride. The sun had barely risen when the first engine rumbled to life. Elias stood near the edge of the lot, watching as the first wave of riders pulled in. Not just veterans, but family members, friends, and everyday people who had seen the video and felt something stir in them. Some brought food, others brought signs. One little girl had made a paper flag that read, "For Mr. Carter." By mid-morning, the quiet town was buzzing with the low, steady roar of motorcycle engines, hundreds of them. Old bikes, new bikes, vintage restorations, military patches, dog tags, photos of lost friends pinned to jackets. It wasn't loud in the angry kind of way. It was a different kind of noise. Purposeful, unified, steady, just like the people riding. Elias stood beside his bike, dressed in worn denim and his old Vietnam vet cap. He didn't have to say much. A nod here, a hand on a shoulder there. Everyone who showed up knew why they were there. This wasn't a parade, it was a mission. They were riding for those who were never seen. For veterans with no graves, no pensions. No thanks. For those who came back broken and were called weak. For those who never came back at all. Captain Hale stepped beside Elias, helmet under his arm. "We're at 312 confirmed riders, plus 2 buses of support volunteers. 2 more convoys will meet us outside Jackson." Elias simply nodded, then strapped on his gloves. The ride for respect officially began just before noon. The streets were lined with people, some clapping, others just watching silently. And for once, nobody looked through Elias. People saw him, not just as a black man on a motorcycle, but as a veteran, as a man who had carried more than his share. As the lead rider, Elias didn't say anything. He just rolled forward, his vintage motorcycle humming underneath him. The flags waved gently behind him. Humvees flanked either side. Cameras followed from above. But Elias wasn't thinking about the news. He was thinking about Tannan Province. The jungle, the heat, the men he led, the ones he couldn't save, their names etched on the inside of his helmet in Sharpie where no one else could see. The first 2 days of the ride went smoothly. They passed through small towns and big cities. Sometimes police greeted them. Sometimes they didn't. In one city, a local sheriff personally handed Elias a thank you note from his father, a Korean War veteran who died 2 years earlier. In another, they found signs already waiting. "We see you now? Never forgotten." At rest stops, strangers handed out sandwiches, Gatorade, and quiet words of thanks. Some cried. Some just reached out for a handshake. Some just stood there, holding their children, trying to explain what this was. And every night the group grew larger. Veterans from across the country heard the call and joined in. Some drove all night to catch up. Others met them at scheduled checkpoints. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, men, women, black, white, Latino, Native, young and old. Their stories were different, but their silence had been the same. Until now. But not everyone was clapping. By the third night, whispers started to follow them. News reports shifted tone. A few anchors used words like radicalized veterans, anti-police movement, and unauthorized protests. Some stations even questioned Elias's record again, bringing on retired voices who had once buried his truth. Elias watched quietly from a motel room, the glow of the TV flickering across his face. Hale stood behind him, arms crossed. "They're trying to change the story," Hale muttered. "Make it about anger instead of respect." Elias didn't look away from the screen. That means it's working. Outside, a young veteran named Rivera was helping an older rider fix a busted taillight. She'd joined the ride on day 1, missing part of her right leg, but not her fire. She was the kind who didn't back down, even from the ghosts in her own head. Elias had taken a liking to her. "Reminds me of someone I knew back in the war," he said once. "Who?" Hale asked. "Me," Elias replied quietly. On the 4th morning, the ride almost stopped for good. One of the riders, a Navy vet from Arizona, found a threatening note duct-taped to his bike. It wasn't subtle. Big red letters scrawled across the paper. "Go home. You're not welcome." And it wasn't the only one. A few hours later, another vet noticed that the bolts on her bike had been loosened, intentionally. Panic started to spread. Hale called an emergency meeting in the parking lot behind a gas station. "We stay peaceful," Elias told the group, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the whole point of this. If we get loud, let it be with truth, not fists." Rivera stepped up beside him. "If they're scared of unarmed veterans riding quietly across the country, then maybe it's because they know what we're riding toward." That line stuck. The ride continued, stronger, more determined, more watched. And on the edge of a quiet field in Alabama, With the sun setting low behind them, Elias paused his bike. The group stopped behind him. One by one, they turned off their engines. The world went still. Elias looked out over the field. There, in the distance, stood a small, forgotten war memorial. Cracked, overgrown. He walked to it slowly, placed his cap over his heart, and for a full minute said nothing. No one filmed, no one moved, and when he turned back to his riders, his voice was firm. "We ride tomorrow," he said, "because no one should have to ride alone again." The next morning, they rolled out just after sunrise. Fog hugged the road like a whisper, and the air was thick with something heavier than weather: expectation. Elias rode at the front as always, the black and chrome shine of his vintage BSA catching the light through the mist. Behind him, over 500 riders stretched for miles down the two-lane highway, veterans from every branch, every war, every walk of life. Many had never met before this journey. Now, they moved like one. Word had spread. The forgotten line wasn't just a ride anymore. It was a movement, but so was the resistance to it. By the time they crossed into Virginia, the tone had changed. Unmarked vehicles began to appear along the route. News vans were no longer filming from a distance. They were following. Police cruisers sat just off the shoulder in some counties, officers standing beside them, arms crossed, not waving, not smiling. At one checkpoint, a trooper asked to inspect every bike in the convoy. "Routine," he said. Elias didn't argue. He just waited, helmet under his arm, while the officer checked the bikes slowly, too slowly. When the man finally reached Elias's motorcycle, he tapped the tank with his knuckle and muttered, "You're stirring up a lot for an old man." Elias looked at him. Calm. Not defiant, just, "Sure. Old men remember," he said. "That's what scares you." The officer didn't respond, just stepped back and waved them through. That night they stopped, just outside of Richmond. It was supposed to be a quiet rest stop, but nothing was quiet anymore. Rivera was the first to notice it. A black SUV parked 2 blocks from the hotel, same one that had been spotted 3 times earlier in the week. Different tags, same men, and then came the emails, dozens of them, sent. To Elias, to Hale, even to Rivera and Morales, who had joined the ride to help coordinate and document everything. The messages were vague but threatening. "This ride ends in DC. Stop now, before it stops you. Final warning." That night, Elias sat alone in his room, staring at his hands. They were rough, calloused. These hands had built engines, carried wounded soldiers through jungle fire, and held a folded flag at more funerals than he could count. Now they trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper: burden. He picked up the phone and dialed a secure number. When Hale answered, Elias didn't wait. "We've got a leak." Hale's voice, on the other end, was tense. "Confirmed?" Emails came through private channels. They knew our route, our timing. There was a pause. Then Hale said, "You think it's Cole?" Elias's voice dropped lower. "I think it's more than him. Denton was just a symptom. Cole's part of something bigger, and they're not trying to stop us now. They're trying to set us up." The next day, confirmation came. Morales received a call from one of her old contacts inside the federal system. She put it on speaker so Elias and Hale could hear. "There's chatter about a domestic threat in DC, the agent said. "Somebody's planning to stage violence. They want to pin it on the veterans." Elias didn't flinch. "A false flag? That's the rumor. If you ride into the Capitol, you could be walking into a trap. Media's already shifting the tone. One wrong move, and they'll paint you all as extremists." Hale paced the room. "We change the route. We delay." But Elias shook his head. "No, we don't run from shadows." "But sir," "They're trying to silence us with fear," Elias said, standing. "That's how they've always done it. This time we ride into that city, together, but we do it our way, on our terms." That evening, the ride held a full meeting in a quiet field just off the highway. No cameras, no speeches, just the truth. Elias stood before them, cap in hand. "I won't lie to you," he began. "They're planning something ugly, and they'll try to blame us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He continued, "They want a reaction, a riot, a shot fired, something they can twist into fear." Then he looked at them, one by one. "But we didn't come here to fight. We came to be seen. So no matter what, they do. We don't give them the war they want. We ride, we stay peaceful, and we finish what we started." Rivera stepped forward. "If they see hundreds of veterans refusing to strike back, they'll know they've already lost." Morales nodded beside her. "I've seen what happens when silence wins. Not this time." Hale raised his voice then, commanding the kind of attention only a soldier could. "If anyone doesn't feel safe, you can fall back. No shame, no pressure. But if you ride tomorrow, ride with your head high and your heart steady." Nobody moved. Not one rider stepped away. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He stood out on the motel balcony, watching the horizon. Somewhere out there, Washington, D.C. waited. So did the unknown. But he wasn't afraid, because he wouldn't be riding alone. He turned to Scout, the old German shepherd that had joined the journey halfway through, and gave him a quiet pat on the head. "We finish this tomorrow, boy," he whispered. "Not for the cameras, not for the headlines, for the ones who never made it this far." Scout let out a soft breath and lay down beside his feet. Elias looked up at the stars, the same stars he'd marched under in war zones, in deserts, in jungles. Now, they lit the sky over a country finally listening, and in just a few hours, the forgotten line would ride into its final battle. Not with fists, not with guns, but with truth. The morning air in Northern Virginia was still. No sirens, no shouting. Just the low hum of engines warming up, and the sound of hundreds of people moving quietly, purposefully, getting ready to ride the final stretch. Elias stood next to his bike in the pre-dawn light. His fingers traced the edge of the gas tank like it was something sacred. The BSA Lightning purred beneath his touch, as ready as it had ever been. Across the parking lot, veterans were zipping jackets, checking tires, adjusting flags. Most wore something old, a patch, a medal, a memory. Some had tears in their eyes. Some held their children's hands. Some held on to nothing but the reason they were there. They weren't just finishing a ride. They were making history. Captain Hale approached quietly. "DC's already watching. Streets are blocked off. Media's everywhere." Elias didn't look away from his bike. "And the other part?" Hale nodded grimly. "Confirmed. We've got chatter about a staged incident, a planted weapon, maybe more. They're trying to create chaos." Elias sighed, not in fear, but in resolve. "Then let's give them something else instead." At exactly 9 a.m., the first bike pulled out of the lot. It was Elias. Behind him, row after row of motorcycles followed, their engines like a heartbeat that refused to quiet. Over 2,000 veterans rode that day. From every state, every war, every background. They didn't come in anger, they came in honor. And as they entered the Capitol, something incredible happened. People lined the sidewalks, not protesting, not questioning, but clapping. Quiet at first, then louder. Some held handmade signs. "Thank you for your service, again." Veterans deserve more than parades. "This time, we see you." News helicopters circled above. Reporters narrated live. Social media exploded with hashtags like We're Forgotten Line and Ride for Respect trending worldwide. Elias didn't wave, didn't speak. He just rode. Eyes forward, cap pulled low, hands steady on the grips. They passed monuments that had stood for decades, silent stone reminders of service and sacrifice. But this moment didn't belong to marble. It belonged to the men and women who still breathed, still bled, still carried the weight of war. At the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the riders stopped. Elias parked his bike and stood slowly. His knees ached, his back pulled, but his spirit stood tall. Captain Hale stepped up beside him. So did Rivera, Morales, and dozens of others who had become family on the road. The crowd went silent as Elias climbed the steps, slowly, deliberately. Each step was earned, by years, by pain, by dignity denied and finally reclaimed. At the top, waiting for him, stood the President of the United States, flanked by officials and military brass. Cameras clicked, microphones leaned in. And the President offered Elias a small velvet box. "Major Carter," he said, "on behalf of a grateful nation, we restore your honorable discharge status, your service medals, and award you the Presidential Medal of Freedom." The crowd applauded, but Elias didn't reach for the box. He looked around instead, at the sea of riders behind him, at the cameras, at the kids in the crowd watching, listening, learning. Then he spoke. "I didn't come here for a medal," he said, his voice clear despite the years. "I came because too many who look like me wore this country's uniform and were forgotten when they took it off. I came because respect shouldn't be earned twice." He turned to the President. "Give that medal to the ones still sleeping under bridges, to the ones who didn't have an army behind them when the badge got heavy. Give it to the mothers whose sons came home in boxes." Silence. Then tears. Then applause, not for the politics, not for the cameras, but for the truth. Later that night, Elias sat on a bench near the reflecting pool. Scout, his old German shepherd, lay at his feet, tired but loyal. Renee, his daughter, sat beside him. "I've never seen anything like that," she whispered. "You did," Elias replied softly. "You just hadn't looked close enough before." She nodded. "They'll never forget this, Dad." He looked out over the water. "They'll forget. People always do. That's why we ride." She placed her hand over his. No more words needed. The story didn't end there. Over the next year, the Forgotten Line turned into a full organization, supporting housing for homeless veterans, offering legal defense, mental health care, and mentorship programs. Rivera became one of its directors. Morales helped reform her department. From the inside, Captain Hale was promoted to general and used his new influence to reshape how the military treated its wounded, its lost, and its silenced. And Elias? He went home. Not to fame, not to comfort, but to his quiet lakeside cabin in Minnesota where he fixed bikes, taught local kids how to work with their hands, and sometimes just sat in silence, watching the water with Scout at his feet. Until the morning, he didn't wake up. Peaceful. No noise. Just a cap on the nightstand, a folded flag near his bed, and a note left in his handwriting. "If you remember anything, remember this. I never rode for recognition. I rode so others wouldn't have to ride alone." They buried Elias with full honors. No parade, no band. Just a long, winding procession of motorcycles, thousands of them, riding through rain and silence and memory. And every year since, on the same day, they ride again, the same road, the same cause, and always, always at the front of the line, one bike rides alone. Elias's vintage BSA Lightning, restored and preserved, carried now by those he once led, and written across the front banner, held high by a child who once watched from the sidewalk. He never asked for a parade, just a path,